Hi, welcome into a new edition of Top Shot, a program in which we are going to talk to Sunita Narayan today about various issues for which she has been fighting. In a way, Sunita has become a household name because many housewives, many kids, many people think that she is fighting for them. So Sunita, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Suresh.
Now, what are you busy in these days? Fighting for what?
The fights are the same, Suresh. Fighting for clean air, fighting for clean water. And it's getting tougher every day, as you know. Cities are growing, cars are growing. We have more and more diesel cars on our road. Most cities today are very unhealthy when it comes to breathing the air. So we fight, but I hope we'll win also one day.
Yeah. But tell me, Sunita, why basically I don't think there should be anyone who should be opposed to the idea of having more cars on the road. Nobody should be opposed to the more well-being of the people. But is it really required that in the process of acquiring more economic wealth, we have to ensure in a way that quality of air has to deteriorate, have to ensure that quality of water has to go down?
Yeah.
Why it is happening? Is it not possible that we can have both economic well-being as well as environmental concerns?
No, absolutely, Suresh. And I think that's really the big issue today that this country faces, perhaps even the whole world faces. How can we have both? Because we want growth. We particularly in a country like India, where there are large numbers of people who do not have even any form of mobility. You know, we do need more and more cars on the road. Our per capita car ownership today is still very small when it compares to the rest of the world. The question I think that a country like India must ask, and I think that's the big question, is that do we have to go through the pains of pollution, or can we leapfrog into something much better? For instance, I would argue that in our cities today, instead of promoting cars the way we are promoting it, subsidizing cars, today we have cheap motorization because we do not pay for the cost of the car, we do not pay for the parking that we require for the car, we get excise duty cuts on the car. Instead of the government promoting so desperately a private motorization, if the government was to put in the same incentives into public transport, you could still buy your car, but you wouldn't need to use it because your cities would be so well connected, whether it came to a metro, a bus or a light rail system. But if you look at the hard facts today, the fact is that a person who drives in a bus pays 5 times more tax than a person who drives in a car. So public policy needs to be corrected.
Yeah. So what you're really saying is that government has to be very clear about where the public policy direction should be.
Absolutely.
Now in a country like India, where more than half of, rather more than quarter of the people who live below poverty line, and in a country where 80% of the people almost earn less than $2 a day, they can only afford public transport, obviously. So therefore the public policy should be in favor of public transport rather than favoring private transport.
Absolutely.
But then this is a real simple logic,
Yeah,
in fact.
absolutely.
But why you think, where is this failure of the part of the governments, not just a government or a B government, successive government, to capture this reality?
No, I think Prabhuji, this also really, baffles me. I mean, it is so good politics. I mean, after all, we do very strongly believe that public policy should be for the poor. In this city of Delhi, which as you know has one of the highest per capita incomes of India, 60% of people still commute by bus. 20% still bicycle to work. So you're absolutely right in saying that if you want public policy, it should actually be promoting mobility for all. I believe it doesn't happen because I still think 2 things. One, we are locked into a mindset where we are trying to catch up with the world. We don't have the arrogance and the confidence to believe that we can do better than the rest of the world. In spite of everything we say, I think all our top planners today still believe that we must be like New York, we must be like London, we must catch up. And catching up means that we must have, as they have, more cars. But we do not have a vision of our own to say we will do better than them, we will actually rebuild our cities in a way that it will be convenient for all. And secondly, quite frankly, I would say to you, and the harsh truth is, I don't think governments today take decisions. I think corporations take decisions. And I think when it comes to an issue of a car versus a bus, the fact of the matter is that the car lobby is much stronger than the bus lobby. So the finance ministry will reduce the excise duty on cars, will not tax diesel, will allow a car to be driven on diesel, which is subsidized and kept lower for public transport, even though they know that they add to the under recoveries of the oil companies. But they will not do anything because the car lobby is so strong. So the hard truth is, and I think it's something that the profession of parliamentarians should really think of, that you are losing control. You are no longer in control. It is corporate India which is ruling India, and therefore I don't get the bus, but I get pollution.
Yeah, transportation is one area in which I know you have been fighting for it. I remember the days when the Supreme Court heard a petition from CSE about type of fuel that should be used in Delhi. I know that the cost of public health has to carry because of the ambient air quality being deteriorated. Tell me something about that fight. How did it start really?
Well, you remember, Suresh, at that time Delhi was really polluted. I mean, you know, that was mid-90s. You couldn't breathe in Delhi. You would always feel as if there was something hanging over you, black hanging over you. When we took the matter to court, we essentially had argued that Delhi should not take the incremental steps of the rest of the world, because the rest of the world had cleaned up fuel. We said, let's change the fuel itself. Let's leapfrog. And by moving to compressed natural gas, you got emission levels which were not even in Europe at that time. So you got an advancement. You got that jump ahead. And you will remember, you were in fact very much with us at that time, how much fights there were, and that every time the matter was heard in court, a bus would burn mysteriously the night before, a CNG bus, because there was a clear way to sabotage the whole program. There was a lot of pressure. I think, to me, two lessons that I learnt out of it. One, change is always difficult in any society, and there is no doubt about it, that when you're asking for something which is dramatically different, it is difficult. But then if it is difficult, you need proponents who will stand for public policy and for public good. And you need to have information, you need to be able to fight it out publicly, to be able to argue that that change is necessary. Even if it is tough, it is necessary. And I think with CNG, it's a remarkable turnaround. Today, Delhi has much lower air pollution levels than other cities of India. You can breathe in Delhi, you can see the stars in Delhi most days, most nights. And I think that is really the big challenge. And Delhi today realizes that if it doesn't control the number of cars, the gains that it made will be lost. And we are sitting at a time when Beijing, as you know, is fighting for its Olympics and clean air in Olympics.
And they close down the factories, and they're telling people not to drive on the road on the eve of Olympics to make sure that the quality of air remains good.
Absolutely.
You know, this public transport is one area on which you have been fighting, and I've been observing that for a long time. Tell me, particularly when you talk about fuel, you mentioned that you moved from diesel to CNG. But you know, in any case, both are coming from the same family of fossil fuel. Do you think it's about the time that we should, in India, should think about something radically different? A country of 1.1 billion people, should we wait for the rest of the world to discover alternative fuel, or should it be a new leap forward from India itself to say that we would like to discover a new source of energy? Is it something we should try to do?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think India has to think big, think out of the box. I think, let's be very clear, the oil prices are volatile, and even though there are indications that they have dropped to about 120, most people say they are not going to go below 100. And today your oil, your entire oil pricing is done at $80, $88. I mean, so there's already, the oil companies are bleeding, and they will bleed further. And I think it is time that India realized that two challenges. One, we have to become more efficient with every drop of oil we use. And that means, as I keep saying, the bus is much more efficient. It carries 100 people, a car carries 2 people. So on efficiency, that's the answer. The railways is an answer. We need to think big about these solutions which are more efficient in that sense. As two, we need to think about something completely different. Now, it is very clear, and you know this even more than I do, and you know the energy field so well, that the options right now are limited. We all know that. I mean, we have thermal, we have hydel, we have nuclear, and we have renewable. Now, the renewable package is basically wind and solar, geothermal, biomass. I mean, those are the 4 technologies, of which Wind is a mature technology, it's competitive with the other technologies. Solar, the price is so high that you need a major breakthrough and a major investment to be able to bring down the price. And biomass as well as geothermal are very localized solutions. Now, I think what India really needs, big time, is to do massive investments in solar, because that is the only technology today which is the technology perhaps of challenging fossil fuel, of the scale that is needed. I mean, very clearly we need more energy. You come from Maharashtra, which is talking about what crippling power cuts today.
8,000 megawatts of shortage almost.
Or shortage, you know, we need more energy, but clearly solar and clearly efficiency and clearly more distributed power. I mean, another problem we have is today we are losing so much energy just in transporting it.
So this could be, all this what you talked about could be the alternatives for electricity in a distributed generation basis as well as to grid connectivity.
That's right.
But as a transportation we need alternate fuel, so probably for a long time we thought that we have found a solution, the win-win situation in which biofuel we touted as one of the great success stories. But now down the line we are thinking, having a lot of apprehensions, people are worried about it. So where do you think the biofuels will feature into our future energy options?
You know, Prabhuji, I think very clearly no option in the world today, and I think that's something we all have to start realizing, no technology option is an absolute option for the world now.
It's not a static option, it's a dynamic.
It's not only that, I think no technology today is capable of dealing with the needs that we have in the world. I think the first thing we'll have to do is to say we have to curtail demand and then find right technology. So lifestyle changes will be as important as a technology change. And I think biofuels is a classic example. If you talk about biofuels and you want to have as many cars as you did yesterday, forget it. I mean, in America, the figures in the US are that if you were to convert all the corn crop, all of it, into biofuels, into ethanol, you would replace 12% of the current gasoline use. And gasoline use is going up, not down. So it's a drop in the ocean. Now, if America was to say that we will curtail the growth of cars, we will move towards public transport, and we will use biofuels for public transport, then biofuels can be an option for the future. And I think that's the creativity that we will have to bring in, that no technology today can provide you with climate change, with everything else happening, with energy security issues. You will need a mix of technology and lifestyle changes.
So what you're saying is not just supply side option in terms of replacing one source of supply with another, but also stop from the demand side.
Absolutely.
And that's something which is both will actually going to finally converge demand side solutions as well as supply side options.
And demand side solutions will demand changes in lifestyle.
That's right.
And that we will have to learn. It does not mean that we get poorer. It does not mean that we have to become, you know, I was in a recent program with a very leading industrial house, an association head, I won't name him. But after I spoke, he spoke and he said, well, you know, if all what Sunita says we do, we will live in the caves once again. And I essentially find that mindset a problem, that what you and I are discussing today is not about going back to the caves. We are not talking about getting poor. Frugality, as I keep saying, does not mean poverty. Changing in lifestyle, if you were to drive in the most sophisticated bus in your city and you were to actually have a metro system which was, you know, connected to the bus, does not mean that you and I will become poorer. A car is not a sign of richness. A car today stuck in a traffic jam is a sign of stupidity. Because you're losing time. Most of the people I meet say how much time they spend on the road. I mean, as I keep saying, get a life rather than getting a car.
So you are saying don't be poorer of ideas.
Absolutely.
You can come out with good ideas, better ideas to solve the problem that we face today.
Absolutely.
So tell me, you just mentioned about changing lifestyle. In fact, for me, it has always been a conviction that lifestyle change is a real solution, and we have nobody else to turn to look at that reality. Is what Mahatma Gandhi taught us. Absolutely. Now tell me, you know, I realize one thing, having been in the government myself, that lifestyle change is not something which can be brought about by change in laws.
No.
It can be, probably, to some extent, but not to great extent. So there I think there is a huge role for a civil society organization like yours, in which you can influence the people's mind, help them to change their thinking. So what do you think really, how government should help the civil society organization to shape together this common concern that we have got, how to change people's mindset in the process, change the demand cycle, and therefore have a limited supply side option. So how do you do that?
I think, Suresh, two things are needed. One, I think we have to learn that lifestyle changes will demand good public policy. So that you also said, and I think we can't only leave this to an education sphere. I mean, however powerful all of us as educators may become, if the public policy is to make the car cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and make the bus more and more expensive, I mean, you and I can't do anything about it.
It is like a tap, it's like a tank in which there is an outlet which takes the water away, and then whatever you put in this.
Absolutely. So I think first, I think public policy is critical, and I think in today's world where it is absolutely clear that if we want to become energy secure and water secure and food secure, we will have to change the nature of public policy. I think first trigger I would say is that. I think in that it's a role of education as well, because my belief is that public policy, if it is supportive to environment, will be supportive towards the poor and supportive towards equity. And therefore I think it also makes for good politics. And it is our failure that we have not been able to put that public policy out as boldly, as clearly as possible to say this is good politics, because this country needs good politics. The amount of tension you're seeing today, I mean, every industrial project is today facing resistance. And industrialists tell me it's only because there are some vested interests. I keep saying it's not just vested interests, it's also poor people who are fighting for their right to survive. And that, you know, you will need a better compromise between development and the needs of poor people, and that's good politics.
So just coming to this point that you mentioned, and I agree with you completely that you need a proper public policy support. It's like a war. When you're fighting the war, you also need air support.
Absolutely.
When the army is moving in, and then you also need a naval support probably to ensure that nobody attacks you from the sea. So now this aerial support probably should come from public policy. I agree. Now tell me something, what should be the ideal platform of exchange of views between the government, which actually formulates the public policy, and civil society organization like yours? What type of a platform you think is an ideal one, wherein we'll be able to shape a good public policy which is actually addressing these concerns that people have?
I think it's the role of Parliament, and I think we need more spaces in Parliament to do so. My own sense today is that you know, governments are receptive. I will not say that this government is not receptive towards public opinion or public policy, but I think what you have today is such a lack of capacity in government to actually think out of the box and think creatively. And you have the public policy space has been taken over more and more by vested interests. So government is actually struggling to decide between the vested interests of A versus the vested interests of B. Okay? And that's become the role of government. It's a middleman between two vested interests. And that is where I think Parliament has to play, I cannot think of any other forum which has to play a role in breaking
Parliament
that.
could be the forum. How you think, what could be the way, because this is something which parliamentarians also will be very welcome to this idea of interacting more with organizations like yours. Tell me, what could be the parliamentary forum that should really look into it? Because this could be one of the reform one could bring about in the parliamentary debate and public policy formulation basis.
For instance, Suresh, we talked about the Parliamentary Forum on Water, and you're very much a member of that. Now, I mean, it would be very good to look at that Parliamentary Forum on Water and to see what are the various what are the key issues which civil society believes are critical for water security. And then if the forum can work with organizations like us, and there are many others, in bringing that information to bear to government, but in a very structured and a very aggressive manner, because I believe today the time for sitting around and talking is gone. If you're serious about it, then you have to get onto it, and if it's a street fight, you get onto it. If it's a road fight, you get onto it. If it's another kind, you just have to be at it. And I think that's the kind of somewhere the engagement we need. I mean, climate change is another issue, energy security is another issue, the issue that we are very concerned by, which is the growth of toxins in our food, in our water, is another issue. But again, you know, we need ways in which you can have a powerful way of holding government accountable.
And that's the parliament job. In fact, parliament has to exercise control over the executive.
Absolutely.
Therefore, you think the parliament is a good organization. In any case, parliamentarians represent the people, and you also try to derive your strength from the people. So you think there's a convergence there?
Absolutely. And I must say, in my experience, and you know this, I've said this often, I think parliamentarians are very aware, perhaps much more aware than anyone else of what's happening in the country. They have their pulse. Yeah. Their hand on the pulse. The problem is today in the structures, the role for parliamentarians to play a very aggressive and a structured role to hold government accountable is there through your committees, but I don't think it's powerful enough, and I think that space has to be.
That's something which again we really need to look into, how the parliaments can play that role generally, with you and others. But we'll talk about it a little later. We are talking to Sunita Narayan, Director of CSE, the person who has been fighting many battles for people of India, and we'll continue talking to her a little after some time. We are taking a small break. Don't go away. We are talking to Sunita Narayan. So welcome back in Top Shot program, in which we are talking to Sunita Narayan, Director of Center for Science and Environment, CSE. Sunita, we are talking on, you said very interestingly that how we should change our thinking, how should we change our lifestyles, how we should bring in parliamentarians to change public policy. You know, one of the issues that always agitate any member of parliament, and something which has not yet entered a public policy debate as much as it should have been, is the issue of water.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, we probably one day can live without energy.
Yeah.
In a sense, the type of energy that we're used to. Because in any case, 45% of people in India live in darkness anyway. Then others, 55%, live in darkness for about 7, 8 hours, 9 hours, 15 hours, depending upon the load shedding timings in that area. But no one can live without water.
No way.
Now tell me, why you think, despite the fact that water is something which is so critical for human survival, for biodiversity survival, still we are not able to focus on that issue as the top priority for the country, which has we are only 4% of the water of the world?
I think what I have found is every time I've spoken to parliamentarians, they understand this issue. It's a top issue. They face it every day, and I'm sure they understand the desperation, because it is a desperation. I mean, and I think the problem is that every time we look at water, we get lost in the technical details of water. So we don't look at water as a politics issue, and it's a political issue. Water is about rights. Water is about a technology option which is most affordable, most convenient, and most reachable, where we have to put water back into politics. And I think it's, you know, many years ago it was said that every time you make a ministry for something, you finish an issue. And I think in some senses what we ended up doing is, it's not about the Ministry of Water Resources per se, but the fact that water has become a governmental issue. We tend to think of it, अरे वो engineers solve करेंगे, वो engineers बताएंगे क्या करना है, बांध बनाना है कि वहाँ पर कुछ और करना है. You know, it's become a sort of help, you know, people feel very helpless and disempowered. But on the other hand, when I think about it also, Suresh, you think about it, since we've been talking about this for so long now. I mean, look at the way people are now beginning to manage their water. You're also seeing a revolution in this country where people are building water bodies, they are protecting water bodies, ponds are coming back to life now. Rainwater harvesting is becoming part of the dictum of water management. And I think that is there, but I don't think we're doing enough. And water is an issue which makes me cry.
I understand, because this is something which brings water into the eyes of so many women of India, because they are the ones who have to finally suffer, because they are the ones who have to fetch water for the household, like they are supposed to be the responsibility of the woman alone. But you know, on water, one issue, Sunita, you highlighted, and I think no one did that before you actually done a campaign on it, was on quality of water.
Yes.
You think after so many years of independence, because water was always flowing into the rivers and it was available in the lakes, then we found a solution of taking it out from surface, below the surface, from the groundwater. But tell me, quality something, why we never had any legislation on quality of water, why we never had standards which we must stipulate in India for a potable drinking water, why
Absolutely. No, I think a very good question, and I think what's happened is, like you said, we had so much, so we never worried about it. We thought our rivers were polluted, but our drinking water was not polluted, and we somehow felt that we would be able to deal with it. But today we have a double burden. I mean, we have a burden of a poor country which is polluting its water because of bacterial load, because we have so much excreta and so much sewage that we cannot treat. And on the other hand, we are also a modern country, so we have the growing toxins which are polluting our groundwater, whether it is pesticide, whether it is chemicals which are polluting our water today. And today every municipality is finding it impossible to clean water and to supply it. And as a result, what's happening is that you have these massive, the big multinationals are making huge amount of money by selling us bottled water. And that bottled water, I think, is a scam, because at the end of the day, you take a plastic bottle, you transport it long distances using, also emitting huge amount of pollution, and you've bored a well somewhere, taken out the water, you don't pay a penny for that water to local communities, you don't pay for water. So you and I buy that bottle for 12 rupees, but we haven't paid a penny for, the company hasn't paid a penny for the price of the water. So with bad water coming to us in our homes, business is growing, and that business, I believe, is only a business for the rich. What will happen to the poor of India? The poor of India will die. You know, today even waterborne diseases are the biggest problem in the country. And I think it's completely unacceptable. We have to fight it. We have to change it. We need standards for potable water, and we have to learn that we cannot first pollute and then clean up. We will have to reduce the amount of pesticides we use, the amount of chemicals we use, so that we first do not poison our water and then say, now we will invest in expensive technology to clean up.
Right. Water again is one sector in which a lot of convergence takes place. For example, 83% of water is used for agriculture. Now, the way we have agriculture practices is also going to impact on policy on water. So, water is one subject which is not just water specific policies, but probably we need different sets of policies coming from different sectors, from different ministries which are handling those responsibilities. So, you think in the government, for example, if you have to think about one institutional mechanism to look at water issues ministry is not the right forum, because there are no control over what agriculture ministry is doing. There are no control over what urban development ministries are doing. So what do you think should be the structure for dealing with water issues in India?
You know, I have sort of realized that never try and reorganize government, because if you do that, then you run into so many turf wars that you never manage to do anything. I think you have to devolve the issue of water lower, rather than centralizing it on top, which will be difficult to do. Today already you have made panchayats more and more responsible for water. And in the states where panchayats have to play a greater role in the management of water, you will see convergence happening, because convergence is not necessarily only at the top. Convergence is best done at the bottom. And I think that is beginning to happen. But I think the issue that you've raised is not just again an issue of coordinating policies, it's about defining rights. One of the big issues in India is that if you look at the rest of the world, most of the water used is actually used in the rich countries in industry and in urban areas. And agriculture uses a very small segment, 20–30%. In India it is reverse. Agriculture uses the most, industries and urban areas small. But remember, as our industries and as our urban areas are growing, we get huge demands for water growing over there. But this is where India is different from the rest of the world. Our rural areas will still remain rural. You and I cannot sit here and think like Europe, all of rural India will move to urban India. Agriculture does not use water inefficiently. Agriculture is something that uses it as efficiently, because the farmers very rarely get water. So I think we have to get out of the myths, but we have to also understand that this tension is going to grow between urban and rural India. You would have read recently about the Hirakud Dam, that farmers ghear out the Hirakud Dam saying they will not allow the water to be taken to